Welcome everyone to the episode 4 of Newton Podcast. My name is Mohammad. I'm the managing director at the Newton Foundation, and I'm joined today with Ryan Rodenbaugh, who's the CEO and co-founder of Vaults.fyi. Ryan, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Vaults.fyi?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me on the show, and thanks for being a great partner to us as well. My name is Ryan, as you were kind enough to say, co-founder, CEO of Vaults.fyi. And, Vaults.fyi has kind of evolved from where we began, but today at least, we are a single API and interface for people who want to integrate DeFi into their products or access all of the data around different DeFi protocols. So what that means in more concrete terms is we provide all of the market data, all of the call data for transactions, and all of the position and P&L data today for almost 100 different DeFi protocols across something like 23 or 24 different networks. That covers the majority of on-chain TVL, and we're sort of growing into this broader toolkit for any type of DeFi product or action that people want to integrate.
Yeah, vaults have been a very hot topic this year, and I feel like not even that long ago, maybe just a year or two ago, it's been a very niche DeFi only. Like people in crypto knew about it, but it's gone very mainstream now. Users of, centralized exchanges are making it available for their users. You have institutional attention coming towards vaults as well. Could you just give your thoughts on, what changed recently? What made vaults so popular now, especially with like the institutional audience?
Well, even perhaps taking a step back from that question, something we get asked quite often, is why did we name ourselves Vaults.fyi? And, the backstory on that is when we started kind of tinkering on the product like 2.5 years ago or so, the word vault had and still has like a kind of nerdy technical meaning within crypto, right? A vault, the kind of concept comes from this ERC 4626 token standard, which is kind of intended to be like the equivalent of something like the standard that ERC 20 set for tokens. ERC 4626 has sort of set for these on-chain, you could think of them almost like fund management vehicles. And they're actually very simple as a standard, right? They define things like how to price shares and asset value and how to handle deposits and withdrawals, like these very sort of rudimentary on-chain concepts. And we're kind of a technical team and just named ourselves that because, we really liked that idea of the 4626 standard. Now, the term, unfortunately, or for better or for worse, I guess you could say, has kind of evolved to, I think today people use it as this catch-all thing to almost talk about any kind of DeFi product today. And as a result, it's kind of come to talk about everything, but almost like describe nothing, if you understand what I mean. Another way perhaps to think about that is, say you had a friend that was like, hey, do you want to invest in my fund? You might ask, what kind of fund, right? Is it a hedge fund? Is it a venture fund? Is it a mutual fund? Whatever it may be. And the word vault kind of has that same thing to it, right? There are some vaults like Morpho Vault or Euler vaults that are quite constrained in what you can do in them, right? Oversimplifying a bit, you can kind of only allocate to the underlying markets of that said protocol. On the other end of the spectrum, there's these very unconstrained vaults where you as a manager can really do kind of anything with those funds. You can move them to Binance, you can move them to Fireblocks, you can buy options through an OTC desk. And so, yeah, this word vault, I think, has sort of taken on a life of its own. And why has it got so popular? I guess back to your original question. I think as we're seeing more traditional allocators come into the space, the vault actually is like a much simpler comparison to a fund structure in some ways. And so I think it maps pretty well onto how they may think about these concepts in crypto.
So like a simple mental model for people is that a vault is an on-chain version of a fund management vehicle or a way for someone else really to have management over a pool of funds. And I guess in that framing, could you give a bit of background of like what is a curator and what is their role in this?
Yes. So I think the way to kind of think about what a curator is they're essentially a manager. Now, again, there's kind of a wide spectrum. And I think if any curators are listening to this, they might take issue with the oversimplification I'm about to make. But Again, there's a spectrum of curators. And again, even that term, I think is kind of a term that comes from Morpho, I think maybe used it first, or Euler used it first. And the reason that they call them curators rather than a manager is that they have sort of a narrower scope of what they can do, right? So people are putting money into the vault structure, and the curator is making allocation decisions, but I guess you could say they're kind of like curating between this smaller subset of this universe of things that they can do. But when you do go to other protocols, maybe take like an IPOR or an Upshift or even like an Accountable or something like that, the role that steward of capital there is playing is much more of like a traditional asset manager or fund manager, where they can have a much wider discretion of the things that they want to do. And I actually think in those protocols, like in their own documentation, I don't even think that they refer to them as curators there. So again, it's kind of this catch-all term in some respect.
And you're sitting at a very interesting position because Vaults.fyi, it tracks over 1,000 vaults across 20 different chains. And from where you sit, what do you see as like a healthy vault versus one that people should think twice about? How do people who aren't curators or like inside the vault itself able to discern a vault's health from the outside?
So there's many ways to think about that. We today provide what we call a reputation score, which in some ways I think is the sort of maybe like most basic but very useful proxy of thinking about the risk between these different things. Now, it doesn't go exactly into the underlying health as your question has just asked, but I'll explain it and then sort of contrast in a second. So our score looks at the kind of lendiness of the vault, right? How much TVL or AUM has it secured over what period of time? So a product that has had billions of dollars of TVL for many years is likely quite safe, right? If it's been able to maintain that TVL over that period of time. Getting into the actual underlying strategy and health of the vault is something that we are starting to build out now as well. The thing that has made that so challenging is that it is so protocol specific. So for example, let's compare like a Midas vault to a Morpho vault. In a Morpho vault, you want to look at the different underlying collaterals that the curator is allocating to, the underlying Morpho markets. There's sort of another level of depth you can go to from there if you actually want to analyze each of those to like check their underlying liquidity of those LP tokens. CBBTC and wrapped ETH are going to be much safer than say like some new stablecoin that's trying to bootstrap liquidity. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have something like a Midas that starts to really like, you have to go and understand actually the off-chain credit opportunities that the manager there is allocating to. And that's just such a different scope of work, essentially. And so, I think that there's kind of all of these, like this very, very wide spectrum. And there isn't really a good, simple catch-all to compare the health other than like really going in and doing the work on a vault by vault level.
From a user perspective, speaking for myself at least, when I go to somewhere like Aave or Morpho and I'm trying to find opportunities to get the best yield, I just see one number that I care about, right? And that's the APY. Obviously, if it's just ridiculously high, I'm just like, yeah, no free lunch, right? Why is it so high? It feels unsafe naturally. But other times, they're like lower and it just feels safer sometimes because they're offering you less juicy yield. How does Vaults.fyi look at APY and track that to inform your risk parameters and reporting?
Yeah, so going back to the kind of inception of the company and this product, the first thing that we tried to do, and I think we do still very well today, is provide the most accurate APY data possible. And so when we first started working on this, it started as almost like a little hackathon project within our company. And we were actually trying to build this kind of auto rebalancing tool between a few different protocols. And what we found was that if you were using RPCs and indexers and subgraphs and the protocol provided APIs, trying to get APY data from each of these, you might have different methodologies, you might have different ways that they are calculating share, the APYs off the share price. And so we calculate all of the APYs that you see on our site ourselves. And the way that we do that is we fetch the share price of every product that we integrate every hour and recompute the APY data on top of that. As such, I think that we are able to provide the most accurate standardized APY data across any other provider in the industry today. And to us, that has always been sort of the most foundational element of everything else that we're able to do today, right? If you have bad APY data as a starting point, then doesn't matter what you're allocating to, because you're not going to be earning what you think you're earning, or you're getting at worst misled by some faulty APY data.
Got it. From a depositor perspective, like a user of an institution who wants to participate in a vault, what is a risk that you'd flag to them, which is hard to spot, but it almost doesn't get noticed until it's too late?
One of the ones that we are just starting to add we have a specific endpoint for this now, and we're going to be covering this for all the protocols we have, is paused withdrawals. So this doesn't happen an incredible amount of time, but several protocols have the ability to pause withdrawals from their protocols. And that is one where it doesn't necessarily mean they will pause deposits as well. So you could have something that has open deposits but pause withdrawals. And very likely that is not a product that you would want to deposit into. The other thing that I think we do a great job of catching that very few protocols will report on their own front ends are negative APYs. So periods, for example, where a vault experiences a loss. So if you were to go to our site today, and I know I've mentioned it a few times without mentioning the URL, it's just app.vaults.fyi. And you were to sort by lowest APY, right? So most people, as you said earlier, just sort by highest APY. You can also sort by lowest. And you'll see many vaults that actually have negative APYs. And what that means is that they've taken some loss in their underlying allocation strategies, and as a result of that have posted a negative share price update. And so what that means is that anyone who is in the vault during that kind of period could have taken a loss.
Got it. A lot of these risk checks right now, they live in dashboards and off-chain systems, spreadsheets. Where do you provide a lot of that data, and where do you see kind of the shortcomings of having reporting and dashboards, no matter how high quality or fidelity that data is?
So we make our data available really in two places today. One is through our first party site, and then through our APIs, which anyone integrating them can build on top of as well. And so, for example, Newton is using our risk reputation scores throughout the product. So that's a place where they can kind of be made available. Where are the shortcomings of those? So I think, to your earlier point, the shortcoming is actually like a very just kind of human thing, which is, I don't think most people are reading the risk reports in any sort of meaningful way. One of my favorite examples here is that, we also host a podcast, and I had on Seb from Steakhouse. And, Steakhouse puts out these very lengthy, very detailed risk reports for all of the new assets that they choose to accept as collateral just on their blog. And, Seb was saying that they obviously can see the metrics of who clicks on these pages. And it's like, 5 clicks, I forget the numbers, but let's just say, 5 clicks per month that actually are reading these reports compared to the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that are allocated to their strategies. And so, the delta there is just this human piece. And, going back to my earlier point, I think there's always this challenge with risk scores or whatever you want to call them of, how legible do you want to make these to the user, right? Do you want to just call them A+, AF, or do you want to make them a little bit more choose your own adventure, where you can actually explain and give all of the depth to a user to say, here are the risk factors. And just because this risk is present, does not mean that this is actually a bad strategy. It is just something to be aware of. But then codifying that into something like a B+ or an A+ is the challenge. So I'm going long here, but also it's kind of how we're starting to think about these going forward. We want to give much more of the raw, on-chain, verifiable inputs, and people can choose to turn those into some sort of more legible score at their own discretion.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit, like, even personally, investing in like an ETF. who's reading the prospectus?
No one.
No one's
Yeah.
reading that. I mean, they're legally required to issue something and have all these risk factors, but people are just like they care about the number, right? But they also want to assume that they're safe and that the system is safe enough to give them protection against these events. DeFi is a different beast, though. So I guess great segue into talking about how we're working together. We you talked a bit about the Newton partnership and how we can leverage the Vaults.fyi data in a way to achieve that end state that you were describing, right? So can you walk through a bit about what you see as the gap between just having this data and if for example, you have this risk score or an anomaly that the vault is unhealthy, and where does that hand off to Newton with actual enforcement?
Yeah, so there's a lot of places here, and today I believe you guys are just kind of consuming the top level score, but underneath all of that, there are actually like sort of more granular fine tunes that a user building their set of rules with Newton can get even sort of more precise here. So let me try to think of maybe like one or two interesting examples. So let's say, for example, someone is using Newton to kind of like run an automated yield farming strategy. It may be the case that they want to set some rules in which they don't allow the agent to allocate to strategies with less than $1 million of TVL, and at no time do they want to be allocating to something with below a 4% APY. Right? Those are really simple rules that someone could configure by using your engine plus our underlying data. Today, I believe the place that this is being used is sort of on the reputation score. And so the way that we output our reputation score is on a 0 to 100, just call it a spectrum, in which everything has an individual score based on today what are 5 factors. So that is the TVL over time in the specific pool or vault, TVL over time in the protocol, underlying liquidity for the LP token, the network that it's on, and then the distribution of the number of holders. We'll be adding more factors into there over time as well. So things I mentioned, for example, the pause withdrawal function, the max drawdowns, and a bunch of other things there too. But for a user, especially as like we flag different vaults as being maybe impacted at any given moment, those are things that will now be passed on immediately to anyone who's building with the Newton engine, and those can just immediately be taken out of any kind of allocation framework someone's building on.
Yeah, so for those listening who aren't familiar with this product, let me give a very brief overview. Newton is an authorization layer on chain. It's a way that you can have rules, policies defined based off of data, for example, like Ryan is describing with vault health, APY anomalies, drawdown metrics, risk scores, things of that nature. And you can create automated policies that get enforced anytime you want to do something on chain. So one of the first products built on the protocol is called VaultKit, built by Magic Labs, and it prepackages a lot of these helpful policies based off data from Vaults.fyi, among other partners. So you can deploy your capital into DeFi vaults with safety parameters automatically being enforced on chain. So it's not just monitoring to see after the fact, after you do something in a vault, whether or not this was a good idea, but it actually prevents you from making a bad decision, because if it doesn't pass the policy, the transaction will not go through. And Ryan, I guess to hand that from the Vaults.fyi perspective, so how does a signal like a health score dropping or an off mandate allocation, how does that become something that Newton enforces before a transaction settles?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to take a specific example of something where that's very useful is, one place where we do a pretty good job on like manual tagging today is whenever there's something that's kind of beginning to happen in the market. So for example, like back when the incident was happening with Kelp a few months ago, and Aave was impacted and a ton of other downstream vaults were impacted, we added manual flags to a number of those vaults. Those manual flags, depending on the severity, can actually do kind of like a rapid decrease of the score while that flag lives on the vault. And so in the Newton example here, if someone had a predefined list of, say, 50 vaults that they were willing to allocate to, the API and thus Newton would immediately pick up that 10 of those had flags added to them, and their scores were also brought down. As a result, they'd probably be removed from this user's allocation criteria or framework. And so that's kind of a clear example of where these two things can fit together. And the user can save themselves from being allocated to a vault that could experience a loss, or at the very least might have capital tied up or lead to unnecessary headaches.
Yeah, it's a great example and a very powerful way of showing how you can take live off-chain data and make that something usable on-chain. And from your side, where do you see the most value from having an enforcement layer? What does Newton let the data signals from Vaults.fyi do that just this raw monitoring dashboard and data can't?
The place that this stands out to me is actually maybe in a product that we've been kind of thinking about for quite some time. All of the vaults that kind of exist out there today are generally made for, managers trying to attract capital and allocating into underlying strategies. There's kind of a whole other class of prosumer crypto users and, certainly like off-chain or like less crypto native users as well, that maybe look at something like Morpho and they say, okay, I can allocate to a Steakhouse vault, or I can look at what Steakhouse is doing and allocate to those same underlying markets. And maybe I'm interested in two of the markets they're allocating to, but not the other five. And I can, choose all of these different Morpho markets and sort of configure my own risk, framework for myself. And I do view something as like Newton as kind of interesting for that layer as well, where a more prosumer DeFi user can almost think of Newton as this is going to be a rough analogy, but like their vault or their allocation toolkit, where they can say, hey, through some account abstraction magic, which, obviously magic is Magic the company, not Magic the concept. You guys are sort of well positioned to have as well, where you can say, hey, I've got this smart account. It's enabled with session keys through my, Newton authorization engine. I can program this allocation framework that I want to build. I want to add new vaults into it over time. I want to remove things. All that's very easy to do with our endpoints. And, they can have this authorization layer that's kind of handling all of that for them as well. So I'm actually imagining this as maybe opening up a door for some new set of products that I think are quite interesting. The other place where I think maybe it has more immediate use is just with existing allocators who, today either they've kind of tried to build something like this for themselves in-house or are stitching together 4 or 5 different things to get some sort of janky version. And I imagine there's a pretty good use case there for you.
Yeah, those are great ideas too. Definitely like light bulbs going off my head as you were making those descriptions. I think our teams have to jam together more on this. All right, we have a little bit of time left, and I think it'd be great for us to do a bit of a lightning round to get your insights on where we're headed and the industry. So let's start off with what do you think is the most overhyped thing in vaults right now?
I'd say opaque fund structures. I know it's a lightning round, but there's a lot of vaults today that you're really just giving money to a black box allocator, and you don't really have great insight into what they're doing with that money. And I think the history of that trend has been quite poor. So,
yeah. Okay. I like that. All right. Most underrated thing in vaults?
Easy looping strategies.
Okay. And your prediction for where vaults are at 1 year from today?
I think adoption is much wider. I think definitions are much firmer. And I think we see legacy allocators like large institutions launch their own vault standards.
Okay, bold. I like that. Hope that Vaults.fyi and Newton are part of the infrastructure that makes that happen.
I very much agree.
The risk in on-chain yield that people do not realize today.
There is not a lot of great collateral assets today in crypto. Yeah, so this I'd say is actually still the biggest challenge for the industry and yields as a whole, which is that crypto is still kind of circular in terms of where a lot of borrowed demand comes from, right? It's crypto participants or crypto adjacent participants looking for leverage to buy more crypto. And thus, our rates can be kind of disconnected from what's happening, with like Fed rates in the US. The other challenge that exists there is that, if you were to go through I think it's easy to do this on Morpho, but the same I think holds true of Aave. Most people are just borrowing against some version of wrapped Bitcoin or some wrapped ETH or ETH staking derivative. There are not a lot of other assets that people are borrowing against. And so I think as we bring like stocks on chain, that is a very interesting use case, kind of securities lending. But I think the risk is that we don't bring those things on chain, and we stay in this place where we have these limited collaterals.
Yeah, and that's an exploding field right now too. Like every centralized exchange is rushing to try to bring every tokenized stock there, and they haven't even begun, just in DeFi generally, making these like assets kind of composable into DeFi. So once that happens and standards are built to allow them to move between chains and users in a compliant way too, I think we're going to see a whole new set of products out there and new kind of lending opportunities. So it's very exciting to see that.
Hope so. I hope so. I'm looking forward to it too.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, Ryan. Really appreciate all the insights, and it was great chatting.
Likewise. Great chatting. Talk to you
Okay.
soon.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Until next time. All right.